Our story starts not with kings or conquests, but with water and earth. In the deep, fog-shrouded past, the first communities took root in a vast land. They gathered in the fertile basins of two mighty rivers. In the north, the Huanghe, with its rich, loamy soil, cradled early life. To the south, the longer, winding currents of the Changjiang provided a different, but equally vital, sustenance. Here, on these generous floodplains, a simple, rhythmic way of life emerged, built upon the cycles of the seasons and the tending of crops. Millets grew tall in the north, while the southern waters nurtured fields of rice. This was the quiet, foundational hum of a society yet to be born. But this land of promise was also a land of profound challenge. The very rivers that gave life could, with sudden, terrifying fury, take it all away. The northern waters were especially unpredictable, their floods arriving not as gentle nourishment, but as a violent, churning force. Settlements were swept away without warning. Generations of labor, homes, stored grain, fragile fields, could vanish in a single, muddy deluge. The struggle was existential. Could these communities tame their environment, or were they forever at the mercy of the currents? The survival of their entire way of life hung in the balance, waiting for a solution to emerge from the mist of legend. It is here that we meet a figure who stands between history and myth. A man known as Yu, who would be called the Great. Tasked with the impossible burden of controlling the waters, Yu understood the river's nature. He had seen the efforts of those who came before, like his own father, who spent years building barriers and dams, only to see them relentlessly overcome. The lesson was clear. One could not simply oppose the water's power. A different wisdom was required. So, Yu turned to a collaborator, a sage of agriculture, and together they conceived a plan not of defiance, but of guided acceptance. Their great work was a network of channels and canals, a system that did not fight the flood, but respectfully diverted its excess, leading the dangerous waters safely to the sea while preserving a portion for irrigation. Can you imagine the relief, the awe, that washed over the people when the waters finally receded, leaving their homes secure and their fields ready? With this monumental achievement, an era of fear ended, and a new one began. Yu, the engineer who mastered the rivers, was naturally looked to as a leader. His reign is remembered as the dawn of the first dynasty. Under his guidance, the society flourished, deepening its agricultural roots. They refined tools cut from stone and looked to the heavens, devising a calendar based on the moon's phases to guide their planting. Yu organized the land into distinct regions, each with its own governor, but all bound by loyalty to his central, stabilizing authority. For decades, his rule brought stability and growth. But as his life reached its twilight, a critical question arose, one that would echo for millennia. How should power be transferred? Who was fit to hold the mandate of heaven after him? Yu's own wish was for a worthy successor, a minister known for his justice, to take the throne. Yet fate intervened, and the minister passed away. Another was chosen, but the people and the regional lords voiced a different desire. Their loyalty was personal, tied to the man who had saved them. They clamored for his son, Qi, to inherit his father's role. And so, reluctantly or not, a precedent was set. Qi ascended not solely through proven merit, but through lineage. This moment, this decision in the hazy past, established a principle that would define rule for ages to come, the hereditary right of kings. The dynasty was now a family legacy. But how long can a single bloodline hold power before it weakens, or worse, turns corrupt? The answer would unfold over centuries. The first dynasty's later years were shadowed by decline. The final descendant of Yu's line, a ruler remembered as Jie, was said to embody every failure of leadership. Tales speak of a man consumed by cruelty and personal pleasure, who led armies for spite and filled his courts with decadence. He ignored the suffering of his people and the solemn responsibility of his station. In the philosophy of the time, heaven itself granted the right to rule, but that grant was conditional. A ruler who lost his virtue, who abandoned justice for tyranny, would find that celestial mandate withdrawn. And heaven, it seemed, had judged Jie harshly. For in the background, a new force was rising, one that had mastered a metal that would change warfare forever: bronze. The stage was set for a violent, transformative change. Could the old, weary dynasty withstand the coming storm? The old order, brittle from within, was no match for the new. The clang of bronze weapons, sharper and stronger than stone, rang out as a rebellion solidified into a new power. The corrupt king was overthrown, and from the conflict emerged a fresh dynasty, one that would cast its own long shadow across history. This was the Shang. Unlike their predecessors, whose story is veiled in legend, the Shang step into the light of recorded history. They left behind a tangible voice from the past, etched not on paper, but on bone and shell. These oracle inscriptions, questions to the spirit world carved onto animal scapulae and turtle plastrons, are our first direct window into a Chinese world. Thousands of characters, many recognizable ancestors of modern writing, tell us of their prayers, their fears, and their daily governance. What anxieties did they carve into those bones, seeking answers from the unseen? The Shang were a society in motion, both spiritually and territorially. They were deeply religious, with a priestly class holding immense sway over the royal court and the rhythms of life. Their worldview was intimately connected to the realm of ancestors and deities, and they believed in maintaining harmony through elaborate and often stark rituals. To ensure good harvests or victory in battle, they might offer sacrifices. To serve a king in the afterlife, his servants and slaves would sometimes accompany him in death. It was a time where the boundary between this world and the next was thin and constantly mediated. But they were also expansive, pushing their influence outward. Their military campaigns brought new lands under their control, and they returned from distant shores with a novel form of wealth, seashells, which became an early medium of exchange. This was a culture building a complex, stratified world. A noble class grew wealthy and powerful, supported by the toil of peasants and the terrifying efficiency of their bronze-armed warriors. For the common farmer, life was one of obligation and hardship, with little hope of challenging the established order. The system seemed unshakable. But where does absolute power inevitably lead? Even the mighty Shang could not remain static. Internal strife and the constant pressure of conflicts on their borders forced a remarkable act: the moving of their entire capital city. Not once, but multiple times. Imagine the colossal effort, the uprooting of palaces, temples, and administration, the shifting of populations, the re-establishment of sacred sites. Each move was a story of ambition, threat, or perhaps an attempt to find a more favorable cosmic alignment. Yet, the core of their power began to show cracks. The later Shang rulers, much like the last of the Xia, drifted into the familiar fog of decadence and neglect. The court became a place of indulgence, while the state's burdens on the people grew heavier. The mandate of heaven, that celestial judgment, began to stir once more. To the west, along the Wei River Valley, a people viewed by the Shang as somewhat rustic allies, the Zhou, were watching and growing stronger. They observed the decay at the center and began to nurture a powerful idea: that tyranny forfeits the right to rule. How long before observation turned to action? The end came not as a slow fade, but in a single, legendary battle. The Zhou, having rallied a coalition of disaffected states, marched to meet the Shang king's army at a place called Mai. The stories say the Shang forces, though numerous, fought with little heart for a ruler they despised, while the Zhou fought with a sense of righteous purpose. The battle turned, and the last Shang king, seeing his reign crumble, retreated to his palace and set it aflame, choosing to perish in the ashes of his dynasty. With this decisive victory, the Zhou proclaimed a new era. But their true legacy was not merely a change of management. They formalized and eloquently articulated the concept that had been brewing: the mandate of heaven. They argued that heaven blesses a virtuous ruler with the right to govern, but will revoke that mandate from one who rules poorly, transferring it to a more worthy candidate. This was a revolutionary doctrine, a philosophical justification for rebellion that would resonate for centuries. It made rulers accountable to a higher, moral law. But could this powerful idea sustain the Zhou themselves as their world grew larger and more fragmented? Initially, the Zhou system flourished. They established a feudal network, granting lands and titles to royal relatives and allies, who ruled in the king's name. This decentralized model allowed culture and the Zhou's sophisticated bronze casting and artistic traditions to spread across a vast territory. It was an age of consolidation and cultural flourishing. For a time, the kingdom was stable, bound by loyalty and shared ritual. But the very structure that gave it strength contained the seeds of its dissolution. As generations passed, the bonds of kinship and loyalty to the distant central king weakened. The regional lords, having built up their own armies, economies, and local loyalties, began to act more as independent princes than obedient vassals. The Zhou capital was eventually sacked by barbarian tribes, forcing the court to flee eastward. This marked the division between the Western and Eastern Zhou periods, and the latter was characterized by a gradual, irreversible erosion of royal authority. The king became a figurehead, a ritual symbol holding a phantom mandate, while real power coalesced in the hands of competing states. The stage was set for a period of such intense rivalry and transformation that it would forever shape the Chinese intellectual soul. What emerges when central power vanishes, and 100 schools of thought are free to contend? The answer was chaos, but a chaos of breathtaking intellectual fervor. The collapse of Zhou unity gave way to an era known as the Warring States period. It was a time of relentless military competition, where 7 major powers and numerous smaller ones vied for dominance in a near-constant state of conflict. Yet, from this crucible of steel and ambition, something extraordinary was born: the 100 schools of thought. With no single orthodoxy to enforce conformity, philosophers, strategists, and moralists traveled from court to court, offering rulers their visions for order, power, and a good society. It was an age of profound questioning. How should a state be governed? What is the nature of a just society? What is the path to personal virtue? The debates of this era would form the bedrock of Chinese philosophy for millennia. Among these swirling ideas, several mighty streams emerged. Confucianism, founded on the teachings of Confucius, or Confucius, emphasized moral integrity, social harmony, and hierarchical responsibility. It taught that stability comes from each person fulfilling their role with righteousness. The ruler as a benevolent father to his people, the subject loyal, the child filial. It was a philosophy for building an ethical society from the family outward. Then came Taoism, with its foundational text, the Daedejing, attributed to the sage Laozi. It proposed a radically different path. It spoke of the Tao, or the Way, the fundamental, unnameable force of the universe. It advocated for Wu Wei, effortless action, or alignment with the natural flow of things, and warned against the artificial structures and ambitions that Confucianism sought to perfect. It was a call to simplicity and spontaneous harmony. Meanwhile, legalism took a starkly pragmatic view. Philosophers like Han Fizi argued that human nature was inherently selfish and that only a clear system of strict laws, uniform rewards, and harsh punishments could ensure a strong, orderly state. It was a doctrine of power and control, tailor-made for the ruthless competition of the age. Which of these visions would prove most compelling to a ruler desperate for supremacy? The answer came from the western state of Qin, long considered a semi-barbaric frontier power. Its rulers, with a singular focus on military and administrative strength, embraced legalism with brutal efficiency. Under a series of determined kings, the Qin reformed its government, standardizing everything from axles on carts to the written script, and channeled all societal energy into agriculture and war. Its army, organized and disciplined, became an unstoppable machine. One by one, the rival states fell to the Qin's relentless campaigns. In 221 BCE, the final independent kingdom was conquered. For the first time, the land we now call China was unified under a single, powerful authority. The king of Qin took a new title, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. He saw himself not as another feudal lord, but as a founder of a completely new order. He truly believed his dynasty would last for 10,000 generations. But what is the cost of imposing unity with an iron fist? The first emperor's ambition was as vast as his new realm. To solidify his control, he ordered the connection and strengthening of old border walls in the north, creating the first version of what would become the Great Wall, a colossal project built with the labor and lives of countless conscripts. He standardized weights, measures, and currency across the land, forcing his new system onto millions. Most famously, he sought to control history and thought itself. To break the influence of the competing philosophical schools, especially Confucianism, he ordered the burning of books, destroying countless historical records and philosophical texts deemed subversive. Scholars who protested were buried alive. His reign was one of monumental achievement and profound terror. He became obsessed with immortality, sending expeditions to find elixirs of eternal life. In death, he sought to rule an eternal empire, guarded by a terracotta army of thousands of lifelike soldiers, a silent host buried near his colossal tomb. But could a state built on such absolute fear and coercion endure? The answer was a resounding no. The first emperor's death in 210 BCE created a vacuum. The harsh laws, the crushing taxes, the endless conscription for his mega-projects had bred deep-seated resentment across the empire. Almost immediately, rebellions erupted. Peasant uprisings, led by men of humble origin, joined forces with remnants of the old noble families. The Qin central authority, designed for the will of one man, fractured without him. The dynasty collapsed in a storm of violence just a few years after its founder's passing. The empire he built with such ruthless efficiency lay in ruins. But the idea of a unified empire, the very concept of China as a single political entity, had been irreversibly planted. The next dynasty would pick up the pieces, but they would learn a critical lesson from the Qin's spectacular flameout. Is it possible to hold such a vast territory together not with pure force, but with a softer, more enduring hand? This question fell to a commoner who had risen through the chaos. Liu Bang, a former village magistrate turned rebel general, emerged victorious from the civil wars that toppled the Qin. He established the Han Dynasty, a period that would become so foundational that the majority ethnic group in China still identifies with its name. The Han learned from the Qin's fatal rigidity. They initially relaxed the harshest laws and lowered taxes, allowing the war-weary population to breathe. However, they kept the Qin's essential bureaucratic framework, the system of centralized, administrative provinces. It was a brilliant synthesis, Qin structure with a Han humanity. Under the long reign of Emperor Wu, the dynasty reached its zenith. The empire expanded dramatically westward, pushing into Central Asia. Why did they look so intently in that direction? The answer lay in a conflict with nomadic peoples of the steppe, the Xiongnu. To secure his borders and find allies against these formidable horse archers, Emperor Wu sent an envoy named Zhang Qian on a diplomatic mission to the west. Zhang Qian's journey was an epic tale of capture, escape, and perseverance. He returned over a decade later without his original military allies, but with something far more transformative: knowledge. He described the sophisticated civilizations and lucrative trade routes to the west. This intelligence sparked the formal opening of the Silk Road, a network of trade pathways connecting Chang'an, the Han capital, to the markets of Persia, India, and eventually the Roman Empire. Silk, jade, spices, and ideas began to flow. It was through these routes that Buddhism, a foreign faith born in India, first began its slow, centuries-long journey into the Chinese heartland. The Han was now a cosmopolitan world power. But could this golden age of expansion and cultural exchange last forever? The strain of constant warfare and court intrigues eventually took their toll. The mighty Han, like all dynasties before it, began to show signs of internal rot. Powerful families at court vied for influence, while peasant rebellions, sparked by land inequality and natural disasters, erupted across the land. The mandate of heaven, it seemed, was once again in question. The great Han edifice, weathered by corruption and popular unrest, finally fractured. For centuries, It had defined what an empire was. Now it was gone. What followed was not a single clean succession, but a prolonged period of division and strife, the era of the Six Dynasties. The unity painstakingly built by the Qin and refined by the Han shattered like brittle porcelain, breaking into multiple, competing kingdoms in the south and tumultuous, short-lived states in the north, often ruled by non-Han nomadic elites. It was an age of political fragmentation, yet, paradoxically, an age of remarkable cultural and intellectual flowering. With a weak central orthodoxy, ideas flowed more freely. The foreign religion of Buddhism, which had trickled in during the Han, found fertile ground in this uncertain soil. Its promises of release from suffering and cycles of rebirth resonated deeply with a populace enduring constant warfare and instability. Elaborate cave temples were carved into cliffsides, and sutras were painstakingly translated. But was this spiritual solace enough to rebuild an empire? In the north, a process of profound synthesis was underway. The nomadic rulers who had conquered these territories faced a dilemma: how to govern a vast, settled agricultural population. They began to adopt Chinese administrative practices, intermarry with elite families, and patronize Buddhism and Taoism. Gradually, a new, blended culture emerged, absorbing steppe traditions into the Han framework. Meanwhile, in the relative safety of the southern kingdoms, centered around the verdant Yangtze Basin, a different kind of refinement took hold. The Chinese elite, having fled the northern chaos, cultivated a life of art, poetry, and metaphysical discourse. Landscape painting found its early voice here, capturing not just scenery, but a philosophical mood. This was a time where the pursuit of personal elegance and spiritual depth often took precedence over martial ambition. Yet, the dream of reunification, the restoration of the universal empire, never truly died. It lingered like a persistent melody, waiting for the right conductor to bring the discordant notes back into harmony. Who would have the strength to pick up the scattered pieces? The force of reunification came from the north, but it was a north that had been fundamentally transformed. After centuries of blending, a powerful new state emerged, the Sui dynasty. Its founders, of mixed ethnic heritage, commanded a hardened military and possessed a clear, vaulting ambition. In a swift and decisive series of campaigns, they conquered the southern states, once again joining the Yellow River and Yangtze regions under a single rule. The Sui emperors were builders in the mold of Qin Shi Huang, dreaming on an epic scale. They launched immense projects to showcase their power and bind their new empire together. The most monumental of these was the Grand Canal, a colossal waterway linking the productive rice bowls of the south to the political and military centers of the north. Imagine the millions of conscripted laborers toiling to dig this artificial river by hand, a river of grain, wealth, and control. But such ambition has a price. The relentless demand for labor and taxes to fund these megaprojects and foreign wars bred the same popular resentment that had toppled the Qin. The Sui, for all its grand vision, collapsed under the weight of its own ambition after only 2 generations. Yet, it had re-established the template of unity. The framework was there, waiting for a more durable dynasty to inhabit it. Who would learn from the Sui's fatal haste? The answer arose from the turmoil. A powerful aristocratic family, the Li, seized the moment. They established the Tang dynasty, a period often regarded as China's golden age, a zenith of cultural confidence, cosmopolitanism, and power that resonated across Asia. The early Tang rulers, particularly Taizong, were masterful statesmen. They maintained the strong central bureaucracy and the vital Grand Canal, but governed with a lighter, more pragmatic touch. They embraced a policy of inclusion, welcoming talented individuals of all backgrounds into government service through increasingly formalized examinations. Can you imagine the energy of their capital, Chang'an? It was the largest, most magnificent city in the world, a marvel of planned grids and bustling markets. Its streets were filled with envoys, merchants, and pilgrims from across the known world: Sogdians, Persians, Arabs, Koreans, Japanese. Buddhism reached its peak of influence, with new, fully Sinicized schools like Chan, later Zen, taking root. Poetry flourished like never before. The works of Li Bai and Du Fu became immortal treasures, capturing the splendors of the age and the poignant depths of the human heart. The Tang military secured the Silk Road, projecting power deep into Central Asia. For a time, it seemed the empire had achieved a perfect, dynamic balance. But what happens when a culture reaches such a dazzling peak? Can such radiance be sustained, or does it inevitably cast long, complicating shadows? The decline of the Tang was a slow, complex unraveling. The very forces that fueled its glory eventually contributed to its undoing. The military expansion created powerful frontier generals with their own loyal armies. At court, factional strife between officials and the growing influence of palace eunuchs created paralyzing instability. A catastrophic rebellion led by a general named An Lushan in the mid-8th century shattered the empire's tranquility. Though eventually suppressed, the rebellion devastated the heartland, bankrupted the state, and forced the Tang to grant near-autonomous power to regional military governors to secure their loyalty. The central authority never fully recovered. The great cosmopolitan spirit gradually waned, giving way to a more inward-looking and defensive posture. Peasant uprisings, like that led by Huang Chao, further shredded the social fabric. By the early 10th century, the Tang mandate was exhausted. The dynasty dissolved, plunging the empire into another period of division, the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. It was a brief, chaotic interlude of rapid regime change in the north and independent states in the south. Once again, the land was split. But the memory of the Tang's grandeur, its unified glory, remained the irresistible ideal. The wheel of history was turning, but where would it stop next? From the ashes of fragmentation, a new order patiently assembled itself. The chaotic period of the 5 dynasties was brought to a close not by a warrior from the steppes, but by a shrewd general from within. Zhao Kuangyin, a military commander, was famously persuaded by his own troops to assume the imperial mantle. He established the Song dynasty, and while he never achieved the vast territorial reach of the Tang, he presided over a revolution of a different kind. The Song era would become synonymous with sophistication, economic prosperity, and a cultural refinement that permeated every level of society. It was a quieter greatness, but one no less transformative. The military was deliberately placed under tight civilian control to prevent the warlordism that had doomed the Tang. Instead, the state elevated the scholar official to the highest pinnacle of prestige. The civil service examination system, expanded and regularized, became the primary pathway to power and status. This created a meritocratic elite steeped in the classical Confucian texts, governing an empire of unprecedented economic complexity. But can a state that prizes scholars over soldiers defend its riches? The Song answered this question with ingenuity as much as with arms. They faced persistent, powerful threats from nomadic empires on their northern borders. First the Liao, then the Jin. Rather than endless, costly campaigns, the Song often chose diplomacy and tribute, a pragmatic calculation to preserve their prosperous core. This strategy came at a cost to pride and territory, forcing the court to relocate south of the Yangtze after losing the north to the Jin. This southern Song period, though born of military defeat, oversaw an economic and cultural miracle. The south flourished as never before. Agriculture advanced with new rice strains, supporting a booming population. Commerce exploded, facilitated by the Grand Canal and sophisticated maritime trade. For the first time in history, a government issued paper money on a wide scale. The cities were vibrant hubs of life, with tea houses, restaurants, and theaters operating late into the night. Technological and intellectual achievements were staggering. Movable type printing, the magnetic compass for navigation, gunpowder used in weaponry, and advanced astronomical clocks. This was a society humming with innovation and worldly pleasure. Yet, was this very success, this focus on commerce and comfort, a vulnerability? A different kind of storm was gathering on the distant steppe, a force that would view Song prosperity not with admiration, but with conquest in its eyes. The storm broke with a fury the world had never seen. From the Mongolian plateau arose a leader of transcendent military genius, Temujin, who united the fractious tribes and took the title Genghis Khan. His Mongol hordes were a whirlwind of destruction, mastering mounted warfare with terrifying efficiency. They first turned west, carving out a history-shattering empire that stretched to the edges of Europe. Then they turned their gaze south to the richest prize of all, the lands of China. The Jin dynasty in the north, which had once humbled the Song, was utterly obliterated. The southern Song, behind their rivers and fortifications, held out for decades with a desperate, stubborn resilience. They employed every advanced weapon at their disposal, including gunpowder bombs, but the Mongol machine, now under Genghis's grandson Kublai Khan, was inexorable. In 1279, at the naval battle of Yamen, the last Song resistance was crushed. A loyal minister, carrying the boy emperor, was said to have leaped into the sea rather than surrender. The Song's age of elegant commerce was over. In its place stood the Yuan dynasty, the first time all of China was ruled by a non-Han people. How would these nomadic conquerors from the windswept plains govern the most administratively complex civilization on Earth? Kublai Khan made his answer clear by adopting the Chinese dynastic title and establishing his capital at Dadu, present-day Beijing. He presented himself not as a foreign destroyer, but as a universal emperor in the Chinese tradition. Yet, the Yuan structure was a curious hybrid. The top echelons of power were reserved for Mongols and their Central Asian allies. The Confucian scholar officials, the backbone of government for centuries, found themselves marginalized. The traditional examination system was suspended for a time, breaking the link between classical learning and official rank. The Mongols were pragmatic rulers, maintaining the infrastructure like the Grand Canal and encouraging overland trade across their vast empire, which brought an even greater influx of foreign merchants, including a Venetian named Marco Polo whose travels would fascinate Europe. But a deep cultural and social rift remained. The population was stratified by ethnicity, with the Han Chinese at the bottom. Heavy taxation and corruption festered. The Mongol ruling class, while adopting some Chinese customs, never fully integrated. They remained a distinct, military elite atop a society they did not wholly understand. The mandate of heaven is a subtle force. It cannot be held by the sword alone. As the 14th century wore on, natural disasters, floods, and famines swept the land. To the people, these were clear signs that heaven was withdrawing its favor from the alien dynasty. The air grew thick with the promise of rebellion. Who would rise to channel this gathering discontent? The whispers of discontent grew into a roar. The heavens, it seemed, were speaking through the land itself. The Yellow River shifted its course in a catastrophic flood, bringing ruin to millions. Famine spread like a shadow. To a populace suffering under ethnic stratification and misrule, these were not mere misfortunes. They were the celestial verdict on the Yuan dynasty. The mandate had clearly expired. From the chaos emerged a figure of humble, even desperate origins, Zhu Yuanzhang. An orphan who had begged for food and spent years in a Buddhist monastery to survive, he rose to lead the Red Turban Rebellion, a messianic movement born of popular anguish. His was not an aristocratic revolt, but a true uprising from the soil. Through shrewd strategy and relentless will, he defeated rival rebel leaders and then turned his forces against the weakened Mongols. In 1368, his armies marched into Dadu. The Yuan emperor fled north, back to the steppe from which his ancestors came. The alien interlude was over. Zhu Yuanzhang declared a new dynasty, the Ming, meaning brilliant. He took the reign title Hongwu, the vastly martial. A peasant now sat on the dragon throne. But could a son of poverty govern an empire, and what shape would his rule take? Hongwu's reign was defined by the trauma of his rise and a fierce, obsessive drive to restore Han Chinese rule and prevent any return to the chaos he had endured. His vision was one of rigid, centralized control rooted in a purified Confucian ideology. He dismantled the position of chief minister, concentrating all executive power directly in the emperor's hands, a crushing workload for him and his successors. He revived and expanded the examination system, making it the sole corridor to officialdom, but dictated that the curriculum adheres strictly to the Neo-Confucian interpretations of Zhu. The empire was to be governed by a literati class molded in a single, orthodox image. To protect his people, he instituted a nationwide system of hereditary military households to garrison the frontiers, and to feed them, he promoted massive land reclamation and agriculture. He was, in many ways, a micromanaging autocrat, suspicious of the very courtiers who served him, and his later years were marked by brutal purges that decimated the bureaucracy. Yet, his reign stabilized the empire and reasserted a powerful cultural confidence. After his death, the capital was moved from Nanjing to the rebuilt city of Beijing, where his son ordered the construction of the Forbidden City, a palace complex of awe-inspiring scale designed to manifest the emperor's heavenly mandate. But what does a brilliant, inward-looking dynasty do once its foundations are secure? Does it look out, or does it turn further in? In the early 15th century, the Ming made an astounding, brief turn outward. Under the third emperor, the Yongle Emperor, the empire launched one of the most remarkable naval enterprises in history. He entrusted the immense treasure fleet to a Muslim eunuch admiral named Zheng He. These voyages were on a scale unimaginable to contemporary Europe. The largest ships were colossal, 9-masted treasure ships hundreds of feet long, leading an armada of hundreds of vessels carrying tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, and diplomats. Over 7 epic voyages, Zheng He's fleet sailed through Southeast Asian waters, across the Indian Ocean, to the coasts of India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. They brought back exotic goods, envoys, and giraffes for the imperial zoo. They projected Ming power and prestige across half the world. Yet, these were not voyages of conquest or colonization in a European sense. They were missions of diplomacy and splendid display, seeking acknowledgement of Ming's supremacy and integrating foreign states into a vast tributary system. So why, after such a spectacular demonstration of capability, did the Ming suddenly, completely, abandon the seas? The turn inward was swift and decisive. After the Yongle Emperor, scholar officials at court, wary of the enormous cost and the influence of eunuchs like Zheng He, argued that the empire's resources should be directed to more pressing internal threats, namely, the resurgent Mongols in the north. The voyages were halted, the shipyards closed, and the records of the expeditions suppressed. The gaze of the empire shifted from the limitless southern oceans to the formidable northern land border. The Great Wall, which had existed in pieces for millennia, was rebuilt into the continuous, imposing stone and brick fortification we recognize today, a monumental symbol of defense and isolation. The Ming chose consolidation over expansion. Within its borders, however, a vibrant commercial economy and a flourishing urban culture thrived. Novels like Journey to the West were written, porcelain from Jingdezhen became world-renowned, and a new silver-based economy boomed with trade from the Spanish and Portuguese, now arriving from the opposite direction. But this very prosperity, and the empire's focus on internal stability, created a new kind of vulnerability. It left the coasts, once ruled by Zheng He's giant ships, relatively undefended. As the 16th century waned, a new and relentless pressure would begin at the empire's edges, not from the familiar steppe, but from the very seas they had abandoned. Could a wall, however grand, protect against the changing tides of the world? The pressures mounted from all directions. While the Ming focused on fortifying its northern frontier against Mongol incursions, a different, more insidious threat was coalescing along its long coastline. Japanese pirates, known as woku, mingled with disaffected Chinese smugglers, raiding coastal towns with increasing brazenness. The Ming military, optimized for land warfare, struggled to respond. This maritime chaos was a symptom of a deeper ailment, a rigid bureaucracy grown corrupt, a court paralyzed by factional strife between scholar officials and powerful eunuchs, and an economy strained by the costs of defending the Great Wall. The flow of New World silver, which had initially fueled commerce, became unstable, causing monetary crises. Famine returned, and banditry spread in the interior. The celestial signs were growing ominous once more. In the early 17th century, a major rebellion led by a former postal worker named Li Zicheng gained momentum, capturing city after city. In 1644, Li's forces breached the walls of Beijing. The last Ming emperor, in an act of tragic finality, hanged himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City. The brilliant dynasty had burned out. But Li Zicheng's triumph was fleeting. He had failed to secure a critical pass in the Great Wall. And waiting just on the other side was a formidable, disciplined force with ambitions of its own, who was poised to seize the mandate from the chaos. The Manchus, a people from beyond the northeastern frontier, had been watching, learning, and organizing. Under visionary leaders, they had forged a cohesive state, melding their own martial traditions with Chinese bureaucratic methods. They called their regime the Later Jin, a name echoing the dynasty that had once ruled the north. As Beijing fell to the rebel Li, a Ming general guarding the strategic Shanhai Pass made a fateful, desperate decision. He opened the gates and invited the Manchu armies in to restore order. The Manchus, led by the regent Dorgan, accepted with alacrity. They defeated Li Zicheng's forces swiftly and then proceeded to claim the capital for themselves. Thus began the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China. Their conquest was not instantaneous. It took decades of brutal campaigning to subdue Ming loyalists in the south. But their success was rooted in a shrewd strategy. They presented themselves not as foreign conquerors like the Mongols, but as legitimate heirs restoring Confucian order after a rebellion. They adopted the Ming governmental system almost entirely, reinvigorated the examination system, and promised peace and stability. Yet, beneath this veneer of continuity lay a reality of strict ethnic hierarchy, with Manchus occupying privileged positions. They enforced the queue, the distinctive shaved forehead and long braid, as a symbol of submission. How would a dynasty of outsiders, ruling a population of staggering size, maintain its grip for nearly 3 centuries? The answer lay in a remarkable series of long, capable reigns. The Qing enjoyed the fortune of 3 exceptional emperors in succession: Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. Their combined rule spanned over 130 years of the 18th century, an era of unparalleled expansion, prosperity, and cultural synthesis. The Kangxi emperor, a curious and energetic ruler, personally consolidated control, pacified remaining rebellions, and oversaw a vast project to map and catalog the empire's territory and knowledge. His grandson, the Qianlong emperor, presided over the dynasty's territorial zenith, incorporating Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia into the empire, defining the rough contours of modern China. This was the High Qing, a period of immense wealth and stability. The population doubled. Art and culture flourished, with the emperor acting as a lavish patron. The Forbidden City was expanded, and the breathtaking summer palace was built. The empire seemed invincible, a self-sufficient, celestial empire that viewed foreign nations as inferior tributary states. But therein lay a fatal conceit. While the Qing basked in its own grandeur, a profound transformation was underway on the other side of the world, driven by the Industrial Revolution. A new kind of foreign power was knocking, not with tribute, but with demands. And this time, they came in ships of iron, powered by steam. The first forceful knock came from British merchant ships. They had developed a voracious market for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but had little that China wanted in return except for one commodity: opium. When the Qing, rightly alarmed by the drug's devastating social and economic effects, tried to suppress the trade, the British responded with cannon fire. The Opium Wars of the mid-19th century were a shocking, humiliating revelation. The Qing's traditional military was no match for industrialized European warfare. The empire was forced to sign a series of unequal treaties, ceding Hong Kong, opening ports to foreign residents and trade, and granting extraterritorial rights. The dam of sovereignty had been breached. Following this, internal catastrophe struck. The Taiping Rebellion, led by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. It became one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history, ravaging the heartland for over a decade and claiming tens of millions of lives before it was finally suppressed with great difficulty. The dynasty was bleeding from within and without. A series of desperate, half-hearted, self-strengthening movements attempted to adopt Western military technology while preserving the core Confucian system, but they were too little, too late. The 19th century was a long, painful stumble from supremacy to what was termed the sick man of Asia. Could any reform save a system so deeply rooted in its own past? The final decades of the Qing were a slow-motion collapse, a desperate struggle against tides of history that its rulers could scarcely comprehend. After the humiliation of the Opium Wars and the trauma of the Taiping Rebellion, the dynasty's authority was irrevocably fractured. Regional Chinese officials, tasked with suppressing rebellions, began to build their own modern armies and industries, subtly shifting power away from the Manchu court. Further military defeats, against Japan in 1895 and the collective invasion of the Eight-Nation Alliance to suppress the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, poured salt on the nation's wounds. Each defeat resulted in more concessions, more foreign spheres of influence carved into the map, more indemnities that bankrupted the state. The very idea of the celestial empire was shattered. A generation of intellectuals, patriots, and revolutionaries began to ask a once unthinkable question. Was the problem not just a weak dynasty, but the imperial system itself? Could China only survive by becoming something entirely new? The court's final attempt at salvation came in the form of the New Policies, a belated program of reform that promised a constitutional monarchy. But it was a case of too little, far too late, and it contained a fatal flaw, a plan to nationalize the railway networks, which alienated the powerful provincial gentry who had invested in them. This miscalculation lit the final fuse. In October 1911, a military uprising in Wuchang, triggered by an accidental bomb explosion, spread like wildfire. Province after province declared independence from the Qing. With astonishing speed, the centuries-old edifice crumbled. The last emperor, a child named Puyi, was forced to abdicate in February 1912. The Republic of China was proclaimed, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule. The revolution was led by Sun Yat-sen, a visionary who had spent years in exile plotting the old order's downfall. His principles, nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood were the guiding stars of the new republic. But declaring a republic and building one are two vastly different things. The nation was a patchwork of regional militarists, foreign interests, and a population weary of chaos. Could the fragile seed of a republic take root in such turbulent soil? The answer, tragically, was not yet. The republic's first president was not Sun Yat-sen, but Yuan Shikai, a powerful former Qing general who commanded the loyalty of the most modern army. Hopes for a stable constitutional government quickly dimmed as Yuan concentrated power, suppressed dissent, and even attempted to have himself declared emperor, a brief, farcical restoration that ended with his death in 1916. His passing plunged China into the warlord era, a bleak period where the country fragmented into territories controlled by rival military strongmen, each with their own armies and allegiances. It was a time of constant, petty warfare, banditry, and suffering. Yet, even in this darkness, new ideas germinated. The May 4th movement of 1919, sparked by outrage over the Treaty of Versailles which handed German concessions in China to Japan instead of returning them, erupted. This was not a movement of warlords, but of students, intellectuals, and urban workers. It was a cultural and intellectual revolution that rejected Confucian tradition and called for Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy to save the nation. From this ferment of nationalism and social idealism, two political forces began to organize with disciplined purpose: the rejuvenated Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, and the newly formed Chinese Communist Party. Both sought to reunify the country and end the humiliations of the past, but they held radically different visions for its future. Their initial alliance would be fragile, a temporary marriage of convenience against the warlords. What happens when two armies, each believing it alone holds the key to national salvation, finally turn on each other? The Northern Expedition, launched in 1926 by the Kuomintang under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, successfully smashed the power of the major warlords and nominally reunified the country. But unity was an illusion. As the march north succeeded, Chiang turned violently on his communist allies in 1927, purging them from the cities in a bloody betrayal. The surviving communists retreated to the remote countryside, beginning a long, grueling struggle for survival. This marked the start of the Chinese Civil War, a conflict that would simmer, flare, and be interrupted, but never truly end for over 2 decades. The Kuomintang established a republican government in Nanjing, embarking on a period of modernization and nation-building. Yet, their rule was plagued by corruption, weak control over the vast countryside, and the persistent, gnawing threat of the communist insurgency. Then, a cataclysm from outside intervened, putting the civil war on pause but unleashing a new level of horror. In 1937, a full-scale invasion by Imperial Japan began. The Second Sino-Japanese War quickly became the largest theater of the Asian front of World War II. The brutality was staggering: the rape of Nanjing, the scorched earth tactics, the countless lives lost. Both nationalist and communist forces fought the Japanese, though often with more suspicion toward each other than toward the enemy. The war exhausted the nation and devastated the Kuomintang's legitimacy, while the communists, through guerrilla warfare and peasant mobilization in their rural bases, grew in strength and popular appeal. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the two giants, weary but armed, faced each other across a ruined land. The final, decisive phase of the Civil War was about to begin. Could a nation so broken bear one more convulsion? China could bear it, because it had no choice. Out of the ashes of invasion and exhaustion, the Civil War resumed with a quiet, relentless finality. The land was shattered, the people weary beyond measure, yet in that weariness lay resolve. The communists, hardened by years of retreat, survival, and rural struggle, moved with patience and discipline, speaking the language of the peasants and promising land, dignity, and an end to humiliation. The nationalist government, drained by corruption, inflation, and the weight of prolonged war, gradually faltered. Battle by battle and province by province, the balance shifted, until in 1949 Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, while the nationalists retreated to Taiwan. Once again, the center had changed, but the land itself remained. With this moment, an ancient pattern finally broke. For more than 2,000 years, Chinese history had moved in cycles of unity and fragmentation, rise and decay, mandate gained and mandate lost. Dynasties rose claiming heaven's blessing, ruled, weakened, and fell only for another to take their place. Now, for the first time, China stepped beyond the dynastic wheel. The empire ended not to be replaced by another emperor, but by an entirely new vision of power, society, and historical destiny. The years that followed were turbulent and costly. Sweeping campaigns sought to reshape thought, culture, and economy, challenging traditions that had endured for millennia. Some were dismantled, others silenced, and many lost. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution left deep scars, echoes of suffering that lingered in memory long after the events themselves had passed. And yet, even through these upheavals, the civilization endured, because China had never been defined solely by its rulers. China has never been only a government, nor only an empire, nor only a dynasty or an ideology. It is, at its core, a river civilization. Like the Huanghe and the Changjiang that gave it life, Chinese history bends, floods, withdraws, and returns. It absorbs invaders, transforms belief systems, and reshapes itself after catastrophe. Bronze kingdoms became philosophical states, nomads became emperors, and foreign religions became deeply Chinese. Even modern revolutions were filtered through ancient ideas of harmony, order, and collective endurance. The China of today, industrial, powerful, and modern, still carries the imprint of everything that came before. The mandate of heaven may no longer be spoken aloud, but the expectation of stability, legitimacy, and moral authority remains deeply rooted. Confucius still whispers beneath glass towers and neon streets. Qin's obsession with unity echoes through bureaucracy. Han identity continues to define a people. Tang confidence shapes culture, Song innovation lives on in commerce, and Ming inwardness and Qin caution still shadow relations with the outside world. Nothing in this long story was ever truly lost, only transformed. Empires fell, dynasties vanished, ideas were burned and later reborn, yet the story itself never ended. It simply flowed onward, quietly and patiently, like water carving its path through stone. And as we look back across this immense timeline, from river villages to walled capitals, from oracle bones to modern cities, we see not merely history, but continuity. A civilization that never truly collapsed, only changed its form. As the night deepens and the echoes of centuries fade into rest, one truth remains clear. China's history is not a straight line, but a cycle, a rhythm, a river that never stops moving. And somewhere within its current, the past is still speaking softly into the present. Sleep now. The river continues,